So thank you for finding the time to join us here in San Francisco, or me in San Francisco. It is a clear, crisp morning, not too warm, not too hot here, and officially the end of our summer. So nice to see you at this moment, and thank you for all taking the time to join us this morning. So I've taken the liberty of putting most of your devices on mute, and that is primarily to optimize the audio experience for everybody. And I ask that you keep your phones or your computers on mute if you're not speaking. And we will start very shortly. But before we do, I just wanted to share a couple of sort of interesting things that I think are relevant for everybody. So some of the Stripe schools, their activities this last week in different parts of the continent, and we're very excited about the training activities that have commenced, particularly in East and Southern Africa, and I hope to share more details of those launch events as I receive them from the schools in question. So that's a very exciting announcement. And then the second is again a programmatic request. If you are involved with setting up a Stripe project at your school, and you have any questions about either the sub-award or receiving an advance award, any of the reporting requirements, and please do not hesitate to email me, michael.reed2@ucsf.edu, or stripehiv@ucsf.edu. We want to ensure that you are able to receive the funds and get things up and running as quickly as possible. So please, as they say in America, don't be a stranger. But reach out so that we can answer any questions that you have and ensure that you're able to maintain forward momentum. So let me take a moment just to take myself off of video. Nobody wants to see my face for too long, and I'll just carry on speaking without the video. So over the next hour, our hope is to briefly give you a little teaching vignette around role plays, and I'll explain why in a second. And then we'll hear from my colleague, Dr. Budak, Jihan Budak, about module number 7, and the care of the patient with cryptococcal meningitis, and then Dr. Musapeli, module number 8, management of sepsis in a person with HIV. And I'll hand over to my co-host Cheyenne Martin, who'll moderate the presentation of those 2 modules. But just to start where I think we've started every one of these webinars thus far, recall that the vision for these modules is that they will be taught in a group setting. We imagine that you will bring together trainees from different interprofessional cadres in groups of 4 to 8, where they will sit down and discuss the modules together. And then we imagine that there'll be facilitators or trainers, teaching experts, who will be able to support trainees as they walk through the module, doing a small amount of sort of classroom teaching from the front of the room, and then far more sort of moderation of discussion, prompting questions, etc., from these small groups. And that's the sort of standard approach for all of the modules. We anticipate that each module will take approximately 90 minutes, and that this will be done, at least in the first instance, as part of a 2-day training event, where you bring together the trainees for a couple of days, and they get to work through several of these core modules. One thing that is common to both of the modules in this particular webinar, both module 7 and 8, is that they do include some role play. And role play is an interesting teaching modality, and so I thought I would just spend a moment talking about role play and its utility as a means for teaching important medical professional content. And just so you know, that what I'm about to share doesn't come from me, but comes from experts in the room. I want to refer you to the reference at the bottom of this slide from an article entitled "Teaching Medical Students to Use Role Play: 12 Tips for Successful Role Play." There's a link for that at the end of this session. But I think it's fair to say that oftentimes when role play gets used, learners don't care for it as an approach. It often puts them on the spot, and they don't like it, at least until they've tried it. And as a consequence, it's a teaching modality that is underused in health professionals training. But when used effectively, can be a highly useful way of arousing students' interest in consolidating their learning, and provides a way for the trainer or the facilitator to engage the students and get sort of rapid feedback and self-reflection in the moment, and thus can be a very useful teaching tool. And it also enables students to put themselves into situations that they may never have experienced, which is important because, as one of the reviewers of the modules noted in their comments to us, there will be scenarios where your learners have to encounter specific clinical scenarios in the modules that they may not have encountered on the wards yet. And so role play affords a unique way of addressing those things. In addition, role play is a useful tool for teaching empathy and helping to understand other people's situations without necessarily being in those situations. All of this, I think, is probably intuitive to many of you as master educators, but things just to underscore as we think about the importance of role play. So 12 tips. So tip number 1, be prepared. And I think this is a tip that is relevant to all of the modules and all of the content that gets taught as part of Stripe HIV. It's crucial that your facilitators know what they're teaching before they walk into the room. And this is certainly the case for the module piece. Facilitators should review beforehand, plan, and if necessary, revise the content. Second thing is to clarify the learning objectives. Understand where the role play fits within the learning objectives of the module as a whole, and then use it as a means to apply the knowledge and improve communications, etc. The third tip is use challenging cases. And I think, as part of this training package, that is something we've done, and we'll talk specifically about where role play is used in these 2 modules shortly. But I think the value of this teaching modality increases as you use it to teach, challenging interpersonal or ethical issues. And so as you think about using role play beyond Stripe, in other aspects of your educational activities, this is something to bear in mind. Fourth thing is packaging the role play, and what this really means is just ensuring that all the learners understand what is expected of them before they begin. So, it may be appropriate to say, look, I want you to be assigned to this role, this role, this role, or there are these 4 roles in the role play. Can 4 of you please agree to volunteering to take on those roles, etc. This role play will last 5 minutes, and we're going to address this particular scenario, so that everybody understands its particular utility. As with any educational activity, it's important that learners have enough time. There are sufficient time and adequate understanding of what they're supposed to do. And then tip number 6 is emphasizes the importance of ensuring that everybody has a role. So if your small groups are 6 to 8 people, and the module role plays only involve 4 people, there will obviously be 4 people that aren't involved in the role play. You could address that in a couple of ways. You could break the groups up and get everybody to do role play separately. Or you could say, well, if you're not taking on an active role-playing role, then we want you to observe and reflect back what your experience was watching your colleagues undertake this activity. Tip number 7, define the ground rules. Look, you know, I think it's important that people can opt out. They don't have to do the role play. You can't force people into that. That could certainly, you know, backfire, and we don't want to do that. So I think, you know, just understanding that this is voluntary is important. And tip number 8, encourage observers to identify additional issues for discussion. So as you go into the role play, you know, make the request that learners observe, learners that aren't engaged in the role play observe, and give them specific questions that you want them to sort of be working on as they watch their colleagues work through a particular scenario. Number 9, assess the impact. So this really refers to using some, you know, evaluation metric to evaluate whether the role play has had an effect. And this is something that has been taken care of, so to speak, as part of the evaluation that the Stripe team have put together for every module. And so we will use Likert scales that will be part of an assessment of whether the role play has had an impact. Number 10, and I think this is an important but often underappreciated component of using role play, is soliciting feedback. Now, you know, not just feedback on whether the role play went well or not, but also what did the learner learn from the experience. And related to that, the other piece is encouraging reflection. So using questions that generate discussion and self-reflection as part of the post-role play activities. How did that make you feel? Or what did you think the patient felt in that experience? What could have been done to improve the patient's experience in that role play? And number 12, maintain a sense of humor. I think, you know, this is true again for the whole module, but making sure that all of these activities are fun, upbeat, and stimulating is something that I think the facilitator can play a key role by setting the tone and the humor for the event. And so, you know, again, something that I think is relevant here, but relevant beyond here as well. So those are my 12 tips. I will share those with you at the end of the webinar, or share the URL link to the manuscript from which I've taken those 12 tips shortly. But what I would like to do now is hand over to my colleague Cheyenne Martin, who's going to intro Jihan Budak to talk about Module 7. So Cheyenne, just checking in. Are you able to hear me? Can you?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Great. Over to you. Perfect.
Thanks. So Dr. Jihan Budak will go over Module 7. She authored this module, which is entitled Care of the Patient with HIV and Cryptococcal Meningitis. Jihan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Cheyenne, and thank you, Mike. And just to sort of piggyback on Mike's comment where he so nicely went through the 12 steps for role plays, this case does include a role play, and there's really many different types of role plays, really on a spectrum. There is a complete scripted role play, which is sort of what this module includes, and we'll go through it. And then there's also role plays where you say one person plays the part of the patient and the other person plays the part of the provider, and then sort of go, and you let the learner go from there, obviously with direction. So you'll see role play used in many of the modules in Stripe. So to start off with Module 7, I guess we'll go through the case and then go through the objectives. And my hope is that through each of those objectives, I'll sort of point out the main salient points that we think are the key teaching concepts. So Module 7 is a case of a 27-year-old man who has HIV, who was initially brought into a rural clinic by his friend and is brought in with a decreased level of consciousness. And through the case, the learners play different roles. They play either the role of the friend, the doctor, the nurse, or a pharmacist or a lab technician, and go through that. And the goal, again, is to sort of prepare learners to provide team-based care for a patient with crypto, and to sort of, and through the script that we have provided, to model team members of all levels speaking up and being heard, treating patients and coworkers with compassion and respect, and using evidence-based medicine and guidelines to provide high quality care. So back to the case, as I mentioned, I already mentioned sort of what the sort of background of the cases and the vignette roles. And in the beginning, for activity 1, the patient is brought into this rural clinic, and people have to decide sort of what the differential diagnosis is for this patient's issue, which is a decreased level of consciousness. So we'll have the students or the learners list the differential diagnosis and try to sort of figure out which one would be the most important. Through that, we actually have them come up with both the non-infectious and infectious causes of altered mental status in a patient with HIV. And really the key point here is to keep a broad differential. So altered mental status is very common, especially with patients with HIV and without HIV. And so the point here is not to say that that altered mental status or that cryptococcal meningitis is the only cause of altered mental status. We want people to realize that there's many, many other things, and oftentimes it's other etiologies as opposed to the cryptococcal meningitis. But then ultimately, in this case, it is crypto because we are trying to teach about HIV in STRIPE. So that is sort of activity 1, it's 5 minutes. And then they move on to activity 2, which is trying to construct a diagnostic plan for workup of suspected cryptococcal meningitis. And here, while the learners are still in the rural triage clinic, they use the 2018 WHO cryptococcal meningitis guidelines, specifically pages 10 through 11, and using specific tables to help come up with an approach to what labs to order and how they will do that. And so that's about 5 minutes. And then they move on. And again, here we recognize that not every lab is available in every location, but the WHO guidelines actually gives nice suggestions on what to do in certain situations. So then while they're still at the rural triage clinic, the sort of nurse says, hey, I'm worried that this patient has meningitis and that he might need an LP. And that's in response to the physician saying that he wants to go home, he or she wants to go home. So right in there, they model sort of team-based care. And then the provider says, okay, let's do an LP. And they try to check an opening pressure. So in activity 3, they are attempting to sort of undertake the LP. They find that the opening pressure is high. They start empiric vancomycin and ceftriaxone for bacterial meningitis because epidemiologically that is more likely. And as a team, they decide that the patient needs to be transferred. So here we have the learners use SBAR, which is a technique called Situation Background Assessment and Recommendations, to sort of either give an update on a situation or to help with a handoff. And so since this patient is going to be going from the triage clinic to the district hospital, we have the providers, or we have the team create an SBAR. So they work on this for approximately 10 minutes. There is a PowerPoint slide that correlates with what exactly an SBAR is and what components to put into each section. So they work on that for about 10 minutes. And that in and of itself is sort of a role play because they're sort of coming up with how they're going to do the handoff. Now, as Mike had pointed out in those 12 steps, an important part is reflection, getting feedback. And so then after those 10 minutes, there's another 5 minutes about feedback on that SBAR where a model answer is given. And then the group works on or tries to answer sort of what they did well in that situation or how about writing the SBAR, what could be improved. And then they're asked to rewrite a new SBAR just to see how it goes the second time around. So that's activity 3. Activity 4 is describing the role of all team members who provide care for the patient with cryptococcal meningitis through use of role clarification and a huddle. So again, using some interprofessional strategies. And here this is, again, the SBAR was more at the triage clinic in the rural setting, preparing for transfer. And then activity 4 is pretending that people are at the district hospital and about to receive that patient. So what is a huddle? A huddle is a tool for communication to either discuss or make changes to a plan. And so in this situation, we want the team to sort of meet, clarify and define each person's role prior to the patient's arrival, to discuss how best each member of a team can contribute when this patient arrives, and to pick a team leader. So that takes about 5 minutes. And then they move on to activity number 5, which is anticipating the CSF profile of a patient with cryptococcal meningitis, tying a little bit into objective 2, which is really about diagnostics. And here, again, we know that the LP was done, but the results of the CSF analysis will not be available until tomorrow. So in those settings where results from an LP may not be available right away, we want the learners to sort of anticipate and predict what the CSF profile of a patient with cryptococcal meningitis might be. So that is about 5 minutes. I think an important point to sort of mention here as facilitators is that although we are giving sort of common answers and sort of what we expect the CSF to look like, oftentimes there's an elevated opening pressure, there could be a low to normal white blood cell count, and then a normal to elevated protein level. Really, it's important to tell learners that, oftentimes the CSF profile can appear normal in a patient with cryptococcal meningitis, but that this is just a sort of typical classic example. Next is moving on to objective 6, which is listing the treatment options, medication side effects, and toxicity monitoring for cryptococcal meningitis. So here, again, the CSF results won't be back, but they have a high suspicion for cryptococcal meningitis. The patient is already on empiric vancomycin and ceftriaxone for bacterial meningitis. And here we want the learners to come up with how to empirically start treating for cryptococcal meningitis. And in this, they use, again, the WHO guidelines, specifically page 17 and page 23, which nicely shows sort of induction, consolidation, and maintenance treatment regimens, and then also how to monitor for toxicity. Now, again, we recognize that not every medication is available in every situation, but the guideline does say sort of, if this is not available, use X medication. And we really just want people sort of to be aware that these are the treatment options. It's not necessary for the learner to specifically say, oh, for 2 weeks they will have induction, and then based on X results, they will move to fluconazole for 8 weeks. It's not really about those details, but it's more so that any provider knows what are the general treatment options, what are some of the side effects we need to be looking for, all team members, when caring for a patient with cryptococcal meningitis, and what toxicity should be worried about. So if you are you're preparing nurses in a district hospital to care for patients with cryptococcal meningitis, what should they look for on days 3? Or what should the pharmacist be aware of? What should the sort of lab technician be aware of? And in this situation, and through this role play, we actually have the lab technician say, hey, actually, these labs will be ready in the afternoon, and sort of bringing all members of the team in, because really caring for a patient with crypto is a team-based approach. So then in this situation, we continue to care for the patient. He happens to be started on amphotericin B and fluconazole. And in the morning on rounds, the nurse mentions that the nurse is doing an SBAR, again, sort of modeling what we have just learned in an earlier activity, and says that he's no longer arousable, and sort of suggests that the team address this change in mental status. So the doctor says, I think that his ICP is increased and that we need to do another LP. So in the role play, they are preparing for an LP, and that leads into activity 7, just describing management principles of increased intracranial pressure. This is really a discussion and just meant to be about 5 minutes about ways to sort of discuss how might one measure, or how might one manage ICP. There's really not much. It's mostly just serial lumbar punctures. But again, there is a answer slide to show sort of a model answer and how to deal with this. Then moving on, the patient gets his LP, he improves, and it's the next morning on rounds, and the nurse sort of queries, should we restart this patient's ARVs? And here actually many members of the team say, oh, usually we postpone ART in cryptococcal meningitis, and the question is sort of why, and that's because of the COAT study. So in activity 8, We have the learners describe an approach to ART initiation in a patient with cryptomeningitis. And so this is a 20-minute activity. This is really using evidence-based medicine. In part of their packet, they have the COAT abstract, which is just one page, and also table 1 of the COAT study. And then they sort of go through the study itself. For the facilitators, it might be useful to just mention that this was a sort of randomized controlled trial of 177 HIV-positive, ART-naive patients in Uganda and South Africa who were already on cryptococcal meningitis treatment. And they randomized the patients to either early ART initiation, which was 1 to 2 weeks after diagnosis, versus deferred ART initiation, which was 5 weeks after diagnosis. And we do have the learners look at table 1 so they recognize who the patients were. And in this randomized control trial, it was an even mix of men and women, with people who had high opening pressures, low median CD4 counts of 18 to 28. And interestingly, in this group, the sort of CSF white blood cell counts less than 5 did worse in early ART than deferred ART. They also found that 26-week mortality with early ART was higher than deferred ART, and that the incidence of cryptococcal iris did not differ between those two groups. And so we really want the sort of learners to take away that deferred ART after diagnosis of cryptococcal meningitis is associated with improved survival, especially in those patients who have a low CSF white blood cell count. And so, again, there will be a table. We'll ask them to sort of fill that out. As facilitators, I think it's just important if they have questions on how to interpret table 1 or how to sort of read the abstract that you can guide them. And then we have a model answer. Again, if you would like to add to that or take away from that, or I guess rather just add to it, because what we have given is really a basic answer. If you would like to add to that, that's fine or encouraged, but I just thought that we could mention that. And then lastly, to conclude this entire activity, we sort of say what happened to the patient. He gets treated with amphotericin B and fluconazole. He improves. He's transitioned to fluconazole therapy. And then after 6 weeks, he's started on ART. And then we ask the learners to sort of to reflect how their practice will change based on this module, and how they plan to provide better care for a patient with cryptococcal meningitis after this session. Again, sort of asking for debrief and self-reflection on this scripted role play, and then also, in a way, eliciting feedback on how the module went. And so that's mostly about it, Cheyenne and everybody.
Thank you, Jihan. As you go into your final slide and respond to these key questions, can you go into more detail on the communication strategies of SBAR and Huddle and how they contribute to either quality improvement or interprofessional collaboration or both?
Certainly. So I can actually answer the bottom 2 questions on this slide first, since Shan is asking about SBAR and the Huddle. So the IPE tools we are sort of using and wanting learners to come away with during this module is both SBAR, again, situation, background, assessment, and recommendation, and the Huddle. And through the Huddle, also having people sort of do role clarification. Now, SBAR can be either an interprofessional education tool or a quality improvement tool. As you can imagine, it just depends on how you're using it. If you're working someplace and you recognize that handoffs are not going well, then you may institute sort of a improvement in SBAR as a QI sort of approach. But here we're actually really trying to use it more as an interprofessional activity. So again, SBAR is mostly just meant as a sort of regimented way to share information about a patient. And then the Huddle is also a way to bring people together to sort of discuss or make changes to a plan. The United States Department of Health and Human Services has this nice team steps approach, which is really sort of a interprofessional approach to healthcare. And there's a nice 30-second video on a Huddle, and I can share that with Mike if that would be helpful to sort of send others, so that the facilitators, so that you guys can see what a Huddle is, And I'll see if they've got a nice example of like an SBAR video so that you can see how that goes. I think one idea I had for the huddle specifically was that, you could describe to the learners what a huddle is. You could show them this 30-second video depending on your connectivity, or the facilitators could sort of give an example of a huddle themselves. So pretending that they're huddling, and that way learners will sort of see what that is. So those are the main tools that we're using in this module. And then as far as what learning methods are we employing, there are a couple. So one, we're modeling team-based care through the script. Again, we're trying to neutralize hierarchy, and we're also trying to show people sharing their opinions and really welcoming that through this scripted role play. And then we also sort of want to sort of show the learners that they sort of should have autonomy on how they will create the SBAR, and that they should work on this on their own, or how they will run the huddle, and sort of have people practice doing this so that they sort of practice it as many times as possible before they go into the actual clinical setting, and then they can practice it there. We also are sort of sharing how to use guidelines and how to use evidence-based medicine. And then there is a fair amount of reflection throughout the course of this module. And then as far as the core content that we're trying to communicate, I think, again, that given that cryptococcal meningitis management is different than other meningitis, the core content we're trying to communicate is what are the best practices for cryptococcal meningitis, including sort of following the WHO guidelines and using evidence-based medicine to do so, to recognize roles of all healthcare professionals in care of the patient with cryptococcal meningitis and at different hospital settings, whether there be a rural clinic, a district hospital, and then obviously some people will be working at a tertiary center, and then also teamwork and communication. So hopefully those are sort of that addresses those questions.
Thank you, that was wonderful. If there's any questions, you can enter them into the chat box, and then Gian can address them. But just looking at the time, and with no questions now, we can move on to the next module. And then we can circle back to questions if there are any. So module 8 was authored by Dr. Mose Pele, Management of Sepsis in a Person with HIV. Mose Pele, are you on, and can you test your audio? Okay. It actually does not look like, oh no, he is. Mose Pele, I know sometimes your connection is challenging, but if you can hear us, can you say hello? Okay, I know he's unmuted, so I'm going to assume that there are connection challenges. Mike, I know we didn't prepare for this, but would you be able to speak to case 8 or even Jihan?
Yeah, I mean, let's wait and see if Mr. Pele's audio is able to come through. Jihan, you're also pretty familiar with this case, so can you just start us off? Tell us, as you recall, what are the goals of this case?
Sure. I guess while we're waiting for Mr. Pele, I'll just start off by sharing what the goal of Module 8 is, and which is to introduce learners, again, sort of similar to Module 7, but how to provide team-based care for a patient with bacterial sepsis in a patient who's newly diagnosed with HIV. So actually using a little bit of the same diagnosis, this is a case of a 28-year-old man who's admitted with headache and neck stiffness, newly diagnosed with HIV and cryptococcal meningitis, who started on appropriate therapy for cryptomeningitis and actually has symptomatic improvement, but then develops sepsis into his stay of the hospitalization. And in this module, there's like a similar scripted role play, and it's mostly a script of 2 doctors, an on-call intern, and a nurse, sort of going through care of this patient. And then update on Mr. Pele. Still not that. Can we? No, I'll keep talking.
Yeah. So let's just walk through Jihan. So as you know, this is a case that, like seeks to highlight the importance of sepsis in people with HIV, right? And so particularly, you know, it draws attention to how sepsis can be insidious and underappreciated and often suboptimally managed. So do you just want to quickly walk through, you know, some of the different activities that speak to that? That would be great.
Certainly. So, so again, picking back up on this patient. So he is in the hospital and is doing well, but then develops sepsis. And really, I think, as Mike just nicely put it, we really want people to sort of recognize that sepsis happens in the hospital, sepsis happens before the hospital. And we want all providers, I think sepsis more than anything else is a really big team-based approach. And so we want all members of the team to be looking out for sepsis, to recognize sepsis risk factors, and to know just at the bare minimum, what are some basic things that we should all be doing for patients with sepsis, and i.e., you know, starting an IV line, getting IV fluids, and starting antibiotics and looking for a source. So I think that's, again, we recognize that maybe caring for sepsis is not what somebody is going to be doing on a daily basis, depending on who your learners are, but these are some basic things that we want everyone to take away from this. And so I will just keep talking until Musipelli introduces.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let me see if I can get Musipelli on the line. Are you able to hear us now, Musipelli?
I can hear you loud and clear, Mike. Thanks, and I'm sorry.
Perfect. Oh, okay. That's okay. So anything you want to add, Musipelli, to sort of the overarching, you know, presentation of the case, or any of these specific activities that Jihan started to summarize?
No, I think she did a great job. I think just to emphasize that I think this is probably a classic case of critical care medicine in the general inpatient service in our part of the world. So crypto patients are very sick. And I think if there's any case where colleagues can work together in an interprofessional manner to manage the complications, this would be a perfect example. Sorry, I don't know if you heard me. There was a lot of background noise.
Towards the end, it's we started to hear the background noise, but thank you. And then I think if we want to switch from Jihan to you on the objectives, we can do that now.
Sorry, can you say that again?
So no, thanks for adding to the overview. And if we want to transition now from Jihan to you on going over the objectives, we can do that now.
Okay, cool. I think to everyone, the main objectives of this particular case, if you look at least in the opening section of the case, is that we will try to get the learners to identify risk factors for sepsis in folks admitted with cryptococcal meningitis, for instance, and that we try to emphasize that in doing so, learners should not rely on their memory, but should try and use some risk prediction rules that have been demonstrated to aid clinicians and other providers in identifying sepsis amongst our hospitalized patients. And then we try to sort of help them, which is, I think, is a common error that I've noticed in our setting, of reviewing the vital signs and the medical record in detail to appreciate gaps that and things that they may have missed in people who subsequently develop sepsis while in the inpatient service. And again, I try to sort of get everyone from the different professions to think through this, from simple things such as wound infection, care of an IV site, which can be done by really anyone in the team. And then even when we talk about the choice of antimicrobial therapy. I think in most of these cases we go through it, I try to switch and highlight different important points that need to be followed. And in doing so, try to sort of elevate one or other team member to take the lead. And you can see that, you know, when it comes to, for instance, you know, deciding what can be tested for, the colleague from a lab background will then say what actually can be done versus what cannot. So I think big picture, it's really reflecting on the context, appreciating that patients with crypto or severe AIDS get sepsis, and then being able to use risk prediction rules to identify and assess the extent to which the sepsis is bad, and then initiating empiric therapies, drawing on the support of everyone in the team. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted me to comment on. I don't know you, sorry.
Oh, sorry. If you remember, could you go into the steps theory a little bit more? I know Jihan commented, so maybe after.
Sorry,
oh, sorry. Can you hear?
I remember.
Yeah. The steps theory.
I'm sorry.
The steps.
Oh, I'm gonna let Jihan do that. I think she does a better job compared to me.
Yeah. So Jihan, do you want to just talk about team steps and its utility in this piece? Because I think your expertise in this is valuable. And maybe just speak to the use of CUS, Jihan. That'd be great.
Yes, certainly. So as Musopili, oh wait, hold on, I'm unmuted. Okay, as Musopili nicely sort of put it, we in this specific activity 4, we want people to sort of use either CUS, which I will talk about, or the 2 challenge rule. And so CUS is one sort of way to talk about, or to sort of bring up a safety concern. And so it's actually specific vocabulary that can be used to sort of use it. So specifically, you can say, for example, you can say, I'm concerned about, like, or dear doctor, or doctor, I am concerned that this is the wrong dose of a medication. And then you sort of leave that out there and see if the sort of doctor who you're talking to picks up on your messaging. Let's say a few minutes goes by, or even a few seconds goes by, and that your vocabulary and what you have said hasn't really sort of made a change in their what they're planning on doing. So then you can say, I'm uncomfortable with the dose that you are prescribing, which again, sort of, it's a little bit, I think that the vocabulary is nice because it sort of makes it more that you are just worried about the patient as opposed to actually saying something sort of to a colleague. And then let's say it's nothing, like sort of the physician is still going ahead with the plan of using the wrong dose. So then you can say, actually, I'm worried this is a safety issue. And so when you use the S word, or safety, the hope is that then the person's the person really then stops and makes, or like realizes the issue. So there are some nice videos. We can also sort of send that along, Mike, if that'd be helpful, and I can send you those links. Just very short videos to watch people using this vocabulary. And I've used it at the workplace. We sort of joke that I have cussed before, or I have somebody has cussed at me, and sort of really it's a way to normalize talking about patient safety issues. So that is cussing. The other issue is.
And just to say, Jihan, like, my understanding is that it's a way to empower members of the medical team who are often in positions where they don't have the same agency typically to speak up for themselves, right? So particularly for nurses or other allied health professionals who are often, they often feel that they shouldn't speak up. This is a vocabulary that allows them to speak up when they're concerned that maybe another healthcare professional, for example, a doctor or clinical officer, is acting in a way that may may inhibit high quality care. That's correct, right?
That's correct. Yes. And in fact, the 2 challenge rules, another way to empower all team members to sort of stop, or quote, stop the line if a safety issue is occurring. And really, the 2 challenge rule isn't as sort of prescribed as CUS is. It's really just the sort of thought that if an initial statement is ignored, that it is one's responsibility to sort of voice concern about that at least 2 times to ensure that's heard. So if you say one thing and it's ignored, I think the thought is that the health professional, it's their duty to repeat it at least 2 times. And so I think that the CUS gives a nicer vocabulary and helps people be empowered more, whereas the 2 challenge rule is actually the sort of concept that people and that we, all of us as health professionals, are obligated to say something at least twice if it is being ignored. And we need to make sure that the team member who is, quote, being challenged acknowledges that that concern has been heard. So even if they disagree, let's say, with the dose, you have at least said it twice. They have said, I actually disagree with that dose. And then you could either sort of, I don't know, stop, or you could go to a supervisor or go to a pharmacist or do something from there. But those are 2 different modalities to, again, empower team members to sort of speak up if they sense or discover a safety issue or a breach.
That's great. Thanks, Shan.
Thanks, Jihan. So I have another question. So in activity 6, we identify 3 studies on U equals U, or the evidence that goddess U equals U, or undetectable versus untransmittable, equals untransmittable. Mosepele or Jihan, can you talk to more of these studies and how they are brought into the case?
Unless Mosepele has comments, I'm happy to chat about them.
I think the question of achieving undetectable HIV RNA to limit transmission, I think it's a very important concept, and it's sort of, I think, been well accepted and I think publicized well in the high income setting. I don't know what my colleagues on this call would say, but I'd say even in Botswana, there's still a bit of concern about how to message that. And then I think we just need to think a little bit more carefully as individual providers to say, how can we communicate? I think it's an important message that patients need to know about, but I think there's a concern that it may be misunderstood by some who might then go out in the community and engage in unprotected sexual intercourse, even when they're not adhering properly to that treatment. And I think we are struggling. I think even in the Botswana Guidelines Committee, we've reflected on this, but have not really come up with a plan for how to disseminate this important piece of information.
Mr. Pelly, that's a great comment, and sort of being sensitive to that. Maybe the way to address it here is to highlight these studies and raise some open-ended questions about the potential implications for patients, but really use it use the studies as a means of underscoring the importance of adherence and from a provider point of view, checking the viral load as appropriate and ensuring patients are undetectable, right?
I agree, Mike.
Great.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? You can chat your question into either to everyone or privately to me. And then also after the module or after the webinar, if you have other questions, you can send questions to me or Mike, and we will follow up. And then as far as follow-up goes, Jihan had also mentioned some videos. I think a good way to share those would be to add those links as optional references in the cases, as we are working on our version 2.0, which will all be accessible on the website later this month.
Perfect. Thanks, Cheyenne.
Thank you, and thank you Jihan and Mosepele, and also Mike for your comments and for in the beginning going over the 12 effective steps of role play. And if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and close out for the day. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So just a reminder, we'll same time, same place next week, modules 9 and 10, ART adherence and end-of-life care. These are both really important domains of practice where an interprofessional approach is crucial. So if you're able to join, please join. And if not, recordings of all of the webinars will be posted both to the AFRI Health website and also to the meeting invite email that I send around once a week. So thank you all for joining. I appreciate all of your time, and particular thanks to Dr. Budak and Dr. Musapelli.
Crossing. So it was 1545. So for Makerere, they can pay it.
Okay, see you guys. Take care. See you next week.
Bye.
Mm.
The reason that's why was a student from the other